Okay, we want to talk today about breaking barriers, racial capitalism, and the unfinished work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The scope of the talk is as follows: the legacy of King. I want to present that as a contested terrain over which the American right has tried to reinterpret King in a way that I believe dilutes his message, dilutes his vision with regard to a beloved community in America, one that is both committed to racial justice and to economic justice as well. Talk a little bit about the tyranny of colorblind racism, racial capitalism, and savage inequalities, and King's unfinished work, finally. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community, the title of a book that he wrote the year before he was assassinated. So let's begin with the legacy of King, this contested terrain that I'm talking about. Most of you are familiar with his 1963 I Have a Dream speech that was delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Monument to a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people in August of '63. This speech has been basically, captured by the right and conservative elements of this country to basically personify what they believe to be a commitment to a colorblind society. Part of that speech read, "I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," right? Now, the speech itself, talked about a promissory note that was given to Black people that basically when they showed up with a promissory note to collect on the equality of rights and freedom guaranteed by the Constitution, that promissory note was returned insufficient funds, right? And it talked quite a bit about the continued forms of racial subordination, and in many ways was an indictment of U.S. policy and history with regard to his treatment of Black people. But yet it's that one statement with regard to the aspirational America that he pointed to in these comments about his four little children being raised in a society where they're not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their characters, that was elevated to signify the full meaning of his political philosophy, his theology, and his life of activism. So on November 2nd, 1983, King was assassinated in '68, of course. So about 15 years after his assassination, after a lot of agitation and a lot of resistance by the Reagan administration and the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan signed the legislation making Martin Luther King Day a national holiday. And I wanted to provide you excerpts of Reagan's speech and comments during that day, because it's in these comments that I think you'll see the ways in which he was intent, and those who wrote the speech for him. And this was, representative of large swaths of the, Republican establishment and even Democratic establishment to some extent, who wanted to basically extrapolate King to the clouds of kind of transcendent mysticism and colorblind racism. So Dr. King had awakened, Reagan says, something strong and true, a sense that true justice must be colorblind, right? Of course, in 1963 speech and all of his other speeches said nothing about true justice being colorblind. That was a complete distortion of King's words and his life and struggle. And that among white and Black Americans, as Reagan put it, their destiny is tied up with our destiny, and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone, right? And so the way in which the phrasing is constructed here, you definitely see Reagan establishing as the norm, the guidepost, the freedom of white people, basically, right? And that the freedom of Black people is tied to the freedom of white people, but it's true in reverse as well, which King spent a whole lot of time in a very asymmetrical approach talking about the ways in which white freedom, for white people to be free, to be truly free, Black people and other people have to be free as well. And so the ability of white people to be free, from King's perspective, was inextricably connected and integrated into Black freedom. In other words, there was a lot to be gained from understanding and prioritizing Black freedom, because white people could never be free unless Black people were free. So Reagan's colorblind history and the kind of right-wing co-optation of King's legacy has to do with this kind of false juxtaposition, I think, right? In the years after the bus boycott, Reagan goes on, Dr. King made equality of rights his life's work. Across the country, he organized boycotts, rallies, and marches. Often he was beaten, he was imprisoned, but he never stopped teaching nonviolence, okay? Work with the faith, he told his followers, that unearned suffering is redemptive. So this is what he gets out of King's life. This is what he gets out of the struggle, right? That the advice to Black people is basically be content with your suffering, okay? Because this suffering is redemptive in many ways. If you're just patient enough, God is going to make a way. He'll change the hearts and minds of oppressors, and the wrongs of the society will be righted, right? Now our nation, Reagan continued, has decided to honor Dr. King by setting aside a day each year to remember him. We've made historic strides since Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of that bus. And as a democratic people, we can take pride in the knowledge that we Americans recognize a grave injustice and took action to correct it. Now look at this, the asymmetry here, right? All of a sudden now we're talking about how great America is. Not the sacrifices, the loss of life, the maiming, the beating, the inhumanity visited upon Blacks, even for raising the demand that equal rights be extended to Black people. We're not really looking at that. We're looking at, how great America is for having basically allowed this injustice to be remedied by the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, so forth and so on. And we should remember that in far too many countries, people like Dr. King never have the opportunity to speak out at all. Okay. Now, there is a kind of implication that, Black people should be grateful in many ways, right? Don't focus on the suffering of the oppression, the subjugation. Focus instead on the fact that, you're in a great country, and it took a great country to be able to provide you these rights. There is a degree of, paternalism and condescension involved in Reagan's comments, right, that are unmistakable. And it has to do, I think, with basically eviscerating the struggle of the blood, sweat, and tears, the hardship, the sacrifice entailed by Blacks, white allies, and others in basically facilitating a second Reconstruction that would convince America to rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, or certainly to conform to the words on paper that all were created equal. So colorblindness and this kind of asymmetrical approach that Reagan takes in his comments, right? The prioritizing and privileging of the white narrative, of the American narrative, the exceptionalism of America, without really mentioning at all, the struggles and sacrifice needed to accomplish that. Is part of a discursive practice that Stuart Hall points to in The West and the Rest in his 2001 work. He said, not only is discourse always implicated in power, discourse is one of the systems through which power circulates, which is to say that we always have to pay attention to words, right? The construction of meaning through narratives, because the construction of meaning through narratives, the use of certain words and phrases is always within a power dynamic in which those in power can utilize those words and narratives to perpetuate, continued oppression and subjugation. It becomes one of the ways, in many ways, you see, of establishing, hegemony. And that is to say that throughout history, coercion has been, of course, one way to foster compliance and conformity with power and the status quo. But it's also been necessary to basically convince the oppressed that their oppression is deserved, is warranted, right? That it's natural and somehow necessary. And it's also important to to convince oppressors that they are not to feel guilty about their complicity in oppression. They are not to feel in any way a sense of urgency about challenging that and changing that, that the status quo is, again, natural, necessary, and that it is to be legitimized in that way, right? So hegemony is about trying to maintain control by manufacturing consent among both the oppressed and oppressors that, all things considered, you're lucky to be in America. It's not as bad as, it seems. It could be far, far worse. So, just be faithful, and suffer patiently, and the hearts and minds of people will change in God's due time. The knowledge which a discourse produces constitutes a kind of power, you see, exercised over those who are known. When that knowledge is exercised in practice, those who are known in a particular way will be subjected to it, right? Black people are ungrateful. Black people's oppression is somehow justified, right? And legitimate. That it is, due to the shortcomings of Black people and not to a power structure that has created and constructed at every level of American existence justifications for slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, and the like, right? Those who produce the discourse, Stewart said, also have the power to make it true. For example, to enforce its validity, its scientific status. It becomes true by uttering it as true, and by all having the power to enforce that understanding, that narrative with regard to what King meant, what he stood for, and what lessons we should draw from his life and example. So this creates a kind of a tyranny, as it were, right? This tyranny of colorblind racism is something that I want to talk about. The kind of colorblindness is embraced by Reagan. It wasn't new, okay? And this is something I want everyone to understand, that the oppression of Black people and other people in America has been, achieved through forms of coercion, as I said before, but on the hegemony side of manufacturing consent, it is always utilized not only race-specific classifications to achieve that. Black people can't eat at this restaurant. They can't ride on this train. That Black people can't vote. White people can. It's been achieved through racial classifications, but it's also been achieved through race-neutral or colorblind classifications, laws, and regulations as well, right? For instance, the Constitution is basically a pro-slavery upholding and legitimating instrument, right? But nowhere in the entire Constitution do you see or will you find the word slave or slavery, right? You will find reference to a 3/5 compromise, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. And that, of course, was to make sure that the South had unmerited advantage in the halls of power, and counted all Black persons, slaves, as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and purposes of representation, right? You have that. You have the slave trade clause, of course, right, that prohibited Congress from banning the importation of persons understood to mean slaves, of course, for 20 years, allowing the continuation of the Atlantic slave trade, right, to build up the collective wealth of slaveholders, and then once ending the import of slaves, to increase the value through supply and demand, of course, right? So with fewer supply, others had barriers to entry of owning their own slaves, which increased the value of existing slave holders' ownership of slaves, right? The fugitive slave clause that, established an entire administration of hunting down Black people and returning them to slavery, even when they weren't the fugitives in question, right? Black people living, walking in fear of their lives being snatched up, and returned to or being taken into slavery. The movie, I think, 12 Years a Slave depicts this. Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, depicts the horrors of the Fugitive Slave Act that brought a mother of a child to killing her child before allowing that child to be taken back into the horrors of Kentucky plantation slavery, the slave insurrection clause as well. Their colorblind voting rights legislation, right, that never mentioned black and white, but it achieved the purposes of wholesalely disenfranchising black people in the latter part of the 19th century. Literacy tests, right? You have to be, have a certain degree of competency in order to vote, right? So we're going to give you a literacy test to make sure you can read, you can write. Understanding clauses. Let me give you an obscure section of the state constitution for you to interpret to my satisfaction as a registrar. Good character requirements, right? Give me a letter of recommendation from an upstanding white person in the community saying that you have great character and that therefore you should be permitted to vote. Poll taxes. You have no money, little money. Let me take what little money you've got through poll taxes in order to allow you to register to vote. Grandfather clause, just in case those colorblind approaches failed with regard to also excluding poor white people. Let's utilize a grandfather clause. If your ancestors could vote before the Civil War, then you can vote as well, right? Even if you wouldn't pass the literacy test, or you can't pass, or you can't pay the poll tax, right? And if that didn't work to make sure that you didn't wholesalely disenfranchise useful white properless men, then discretionary enforcement would be permitted by the registrar. I just don't think you pass. I think you just need to go back and study some more. You're just not quite up to par, right? So there's a way in which colorblind racism, of course, has been utilized to tyrannize Black people historically, and so we shouldn't think it unique or new that Reagan and the right adopts colorblindness as a way of facilitating and perpetuating oppression. So colorblind approaches in the post-Civil War era. These are a few things that, will resonate, I think, with your own reading and understanding of what might be going on now. Meritocracy and seniority standards were routinely turned to as a way of basically, building on a de facto, circumstance of segregation and lack of resources to education, to income, or what have you. And based on that history, elevating it as a criteria for continued employment or promotion or what have you. So meritocracy standards, seniority standards in employment were often used as a way of justifying oppression. Voter roll purges and ID requirements, right, are being used, to accomplish this objective, as are property tax funded public education, where you live, the value of your home, all constructed historically by, racial covenants and about housing discrimination in housing and communities being burned down, ghettos being constructed, right? That have lowered the value of the homes in which people live. And therefore in doing that, those who live in rich areas under a property tax, colorblind, race neutral law will have better schools than those who don't. Pay-to-play healthcare and legal assistance, racialized administration of criminal justice. Black and brown people are disproportionately more likely to be targeted by police, to be stopped by police, to be searched by police, to be jailed by police, to be tried and convicted by the corporate justice, by the criminal justice system, and in the case of death penalty, disproportionately likely to receive the death penalty. All of this is administered and achieved under a colorblind regime. So this is not simply, Anthony Cook constructing this, or, someone on the left just taking pot shots at, the rule of law, so to speak, and the Lady Justice being colorblind, and the objectivity and neutrality of the legal system. No, it is very much intentionally integrated into political strategy, which was revealed by Lee Atwater in 1981, who's a Republican strategist, was the Reagan campaign director of political operations and H.W. Bush's campaign manager in '88 and RNC chair in 1989. He said it quite frankly. You start out in 1954 when Brown was decided by saying inward, inward, inward. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract, he says. Now you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things. You're talking about, or the things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. That's the objective. That's what you want. That's the signal, the message you're trying to send, right? We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word, right? As you might know, Atwater, along with Kevin Phillips, one of the architects, practitioners of the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy was a strategy by Republicans to basically flip the South from a predominantly Democratic Party ruled segregationist, though, ruled region to a predominantly Republican, again, segregationist ruled region, right? And they were marvelously successful in this process, right? When I grew up as a kid in Mississippi, there were no Republicans to be seen. And indeed, the few Republicans that you did find, they were normally on the side of justice, right? They were trying to disrupt the system in many ways, right? And now, of course, my home state, Mississippi, and the South is almost all Republican. It's hard to find Democrats outside of the Black community and some other marginalized communities. So racial capitalism and the persistence of savage inequalities. Racial capitalism, you see, itself piggybacks on the tyranny of colorblindness, and it utilizes the market, which can appear to many of us as being not about race, it's about money, competition, survival of the fittest, get out and by the sweat of your brow, make something of nothing, and you are rewarded for that, right? And we very seldom understand the ways in which capitalism itself has been constructed on the backs of slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, continued forms of subordination, and how capitalism is really racial capitalism and not just capitalism in the kind of colorblind mythological sense that it's constructed to be. So Cedric Robinson basically coined the phrase racial capitalism in his epic work, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, right? So the Marxist critique of capitalism, he basically said, cannot be separated from the critique of anti-Black racism and white supremacy, right? So any attempt by Marx or post-Marxists to do that and to see racism as a mere feature of the superstructure that is itself driven by, the underlying conflict between, the working class and those who own capital is simply mistaken, because it doesn't, and because if you make that mistake, you'll also make the mistake of thinking that if you can remedy that underlying imbalance or tension by a workers' revolution that brings workers into the ownership of the means of production, that racism, white supremacy, and the various forms of subordination associated therewith will somehow kind of disappear, that they will kind of wither away. And it's Robinson's point that no, it won't wither away. And it won't wither away because, what you don't understand is that there could be no capitalism without racism, you see. There could be no capitalism without racism. Racial capitalism holds that capitalism was shaped by the global slave trade and the institution of slavery in America. It cannot be understood without it. And racial categories were created and manipulated to secure economic advantages for certain groups, particularly whites, at the expense of others, especially Black people and people of color, right? So the presence of racial capitalism has created in so many ways, disparities that that are pervasive throughout the American system. Over the past 4 decades, for instance, the difference in wealth held by white, Black, and Hispanic families has grown. In 1983, the average wealth of white families was about 320,000 higher than the average wealth of Black families and Hispanic families. By 2022, white families' average wealth, $1.4 million, was more than 1 million higher than that of Black families at 211,000 and Hispanic families at 227, thousand. Put another way, white families had six times the average wealth, the average wealth of Black families and Hispanic families, and about 8 times the median wealth of Black families. And you can see from this chart the gold line is Black families, the pink line Hispanic families, the blue line white families, right? And you can see how in, let's say, 1980, 83 or so, the gap between that gold line and pink line and the blue line is not nearly as great as the gap that exists in 2022 or so, between those lines. The delta has increased significantly, right? And, and so this is a period of time in which, there was a full-scale assault on labor unions, and, there was serious wealth being generated in the American society. But those who captured that wealth were, on the whole, not Black and Hispanic families, right? So it's not that GNP has not increased, it's not the wealth has not increased, and the notion that a rising tide will lift all boats is just simply inaccurate. It is not borne out and supported by any of the studies with regard to wealth disparities and the like, right? Now, it's even worse in certain areas in the country, certain pockets in the country, than in others. White households, for instance, in DC, have a net worth that's 81 times greater than Black households. I do most of my community wealth building, community engagement work in DC, east of the Anacostia River in 2 wards, Ward 7 and Ward 8, right? Those wards are predominantly Black, about 90% Black, in a city that is, now minority Black. It used to be called Chocolate City, but it's now minority Black. Blacks have been displaced given all the gentrification and development in the city. Many of them have moved east of the river to find more affordable accommodations, others to Prince George's County and the like. So it's been a scenario of grave displacement. And in those areas where Blacks are the predominant population, the median wealth is extraordinarily low. To the point that, when you take all Blacks in the city, white median wealth is 81 times that of Black median wealth, right? In 2013 and 2014, the typical white household in DC had a net worth of $284,000. Black American households, in contrast, had a net worth of $3,500, right? Now, these disparities are, driven by a whole set of historical, structural, and systemic reasons. You can't understand those kinds of appalling, disparities without understanding the role of slavery in the district, in this region, of Jim Crow segregation in the district, this region, of mass incarceration and various forms of continued subordination, right? These are all linked, right? And to the extent that any colorblind approach does not reckon with that history, acknowledge that history, reckon with that history, right? And try to disrupt and correct that history, then it's only a tool used to perpetuate that history, right? And that's where we are, right? The 3 major factors that contribute to this wealth drive all are connected to that history of structural and systemic racism. Lifetime earnings, for instance. On average, white families accumulate more wealth over their lives than Black and Hispanic families in the same age group, and that widening the wealth gap at older ages. So consider those born between 1943 and 1951, so I can kind of show you how this works. When they were roughly in their 30s in 1983, that cohort, the average wealth gap between white and Black families was 181,000 in their 30s. With white families having 3 times as much wealth as Black families. By 2022, when they were in their 70s, that gap surpassed 1.4 million. And the average white family had more than 4 times the wealth of the average black family, right? There is something that happens over lifetime earnings for blacks and whites in which black people and Hispanic people are significantly disadvantaged with regard to lifetime earnings. Over the course of that life, that means that they have much more limited access to education and to buying homes and for inheritance to pass on to their children. Home ownership is one of the principal ways that people build wealth in the United States, yet Black Americans remain the only racial group with a home ownership rate that's below 50%. In 2018, the Black-white home ownership gap reached 30.5 percentage points, its highest level in 50 years. Racial disparities in home ownership persist today because of the stubborn legacy of racist housing policies such as redlining, racial covenants, displacement from histories of urban renewal and gentrification, so forth and so on. And inheritance is a third serious driver of the wealth gap. In 2022, white families were nearly 4 times more likely to receive an inheritance than black families, and about 5 times more likely than Hispanic families. Though these disparities have fluctuated in size somewhat, they've largely persisted since '89. Researchers estimate that intergenerational transfers explain 12 to 16% of the racial wealth gap. Okay, so let me go on and finish this up just a little bit. So King's unfinished work, where do we go from here? A book he wrote, subtitled Chaos or Community. In a speech that he gave in 1967, and this is about 8 months before his assassination in April of '68, he said, "I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society." And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. Who owns the oil? Who owns the iron ore? Why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? King was not a dyed-in-the-wool traditional liberal looking for and demanding, slight reforms from the status quo that would distribute some, welfare benefits to Black, brown, oppressed people. He was a systems thinker. He thought structurally, right? And although he did not roll this all out at one time, because he would be what I would characterize a pragmatic idealist, right? And governed himself accordingly, his orientation was always, I would submit, a very radical one. And he understood the progression that things needed to take to build momentum, to build consensus, so that one can, in Gramscian sense, move from a war of position to a war of maneuver. King's letter to Coretta, and this is what he writes: "I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. And yet I am not so opposed to capitalism that I have failed to see its relative merits. It started out with a noble and high motive to block the trade monopolies of nobles, but like most human systems, it falls victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. It has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes," right? So he says, in '66, something is wrong with the economic system of our nation. Something is wrong with capitalism. Maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. We must develop programs that would drive the nation. So, here he's, openly embracing, democratic socialism. And I believe that most of his vision and his policies were in conformity with a democratic socialism, not even a social democrat, a democratic socialist, I believe was his kind of true political orientation, right? And he wanted not to forget about racial capitalism and the insights provided by racial capitalism with regard to understanding how American society was to be disruptive and transformed, right? So this is more about his commitment to critique of capitalism and also to racial justice. In the second paragraph, he says, "We must also realize that problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. We must further recognize that the ghetto itself is a domestic colony." What liberal talks in these terms? No, this is not the talk of even left liberals, progressives and left liberals, right? When you are comparing the state of Black people and their conditions of living in America with colonialism, right? And that basically we are an internal colony, right? This is a thoroughgoing critique of global capitalism. Um, Now, I just want to make the argument as well that the consciousness of Black consciousness and Black power figured very much into King's understanding of justice as well. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and strip him of his personhood is as old as the earliest history books and as contemporary as the morning's newspaper. To offset this cultural homicide, I mean, this man had the audacity to talk about the oppression visited upon Blacks as a form of cultural homicide, right? There were some Black power advocates not talking as strongly with regard to critique of Black power. Of course, they came to eventually in the late 60s, particularly with the Black Panthers movement, the revolutionary movement. But, King was, I think, certainly ahead of his time with regard to understanding these linkages, right? So now another basic challenge is to discover how to organize our strength and to utilize Black power. He says in that second paragraph, stripped of the right to make decisions concerning his life and destiny, Black people have been subject to the authoritarian and sometimes whimsical decisions of the white power structure. The plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power, both to confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. Okay, here he's comparing and the plantation with the ghetto with regard to the same power dynamics of control and subordination. And finally, as far as remedies are concerned, King was open to Black reparations, something that we don't comfortably talk about on the left, right? And I think, needs to be part of the way that we look at the critique of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and part of the remedy associated with the transformation of society. He says in 68, just weeks before his murder, at the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they do that, they built land colleges to support them. Not only did they do that, but they provided agents to inform them, to teach them how to farm the land and to how to monetize their work. But not only that, they received millions of dollars, many of these farmers, and to today even, millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, right? And they are the very people telling the Black man that he ought to lift himself by his bootstraps. Now, with regard to reparations, it was clear the King understood that, the injustices visited on Black people since they arrived on these shores in the 1600s to now, cannot be fully compensated by, any monetary measure. Not all the wealth of this affluent society, he said, could meet that bill. Yet a price can be placed on unpaid wages. The ancient common law has always provided a remedy for the appropriation of the labor of one human being by another. This law should be made to apply for American Negroes as well. And the payment should be in the form of massive programs by government of special compensatory measures, which could be regarded as a settlement in accord with the accepted practice of common law. So I'll just end by saying, to give you an understanding of King's understanding of the vision of a transformed America, that it was a thoroughgoing and very advanced class-based critique of capitalism, a race-based critique of racial subordination and racial capitalism, linking the two, right? But he also understood the relationship between racism and class exploitation and militarism and imperialism. He called these the triple evils, right? The triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are inextricably connected, and we are not going to get rid of one without getting rid of the others. And he says the US government is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, right? So this was Martin Luther King Jr., right? A man who I think was extraordinarily complex, subtle and nuanced in his analysis, a holistic thinker, a pragmatic idealist who could move from theory on the one hand to implementation on the other in a way that built consensus and kept things moving. And in those final days, when he came out against the Johnson administration with regard to the Vietnam War, and decided that he was going to move civil rights actions and protests from the Deep South after the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 65 to the slums of Chicago to deal with the colorblind racism that was there, the institutionalized racism that was there, where there were no signs on the wall saying whites only, but yet and still Black people were herded into ghettos, were given substandard services and support, and were discriminated in every facet of life. This is where he was moving, right? Because now was the time, he thought. In that move, both in going against the Johnson administration and in moving to Chicago, right? A lot of even Black people said, I think we're good. It's been good knowing you, right? I'll see you on the other side, perhaps, right? They didn't go. He lost their support, right? And but yet this was a courageous man, right? When he dies, he has a disapproval rating of about 70-75%, right? He is not well liked. And many, even in his closest circles, which hurt him very much, right, abandoned him during this shift, right? But he remained true to the very end. And my question for us is, where is our courage, right, to be dispopular? Our courage to go against the grain? Our courage to have fewer likes on Instagram and social media, right? Our courage to stand up to the forces of the triple evils, right? And to continue this vision for a transformed America. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. This is fantastic. We have some time for questions and answers now. I think, Ben, are you going to be fielding some of these questions in the chat, or should we raise hands here?
I think we can probably raise hands, and I'm going to change the hosting tools here to allow people to unmute themselves. So we'll go on who we have in the room here. And if you want to just you want to handle fielding those, John, and or maybe Anthony?
If I can see hands, let's see. Once we change
I'll
this,
help you out. I'll back you up.
might need to quit sharing the
Oh,
PowerPoint.
okay. Yeah, let me do that.
Let's do that. And thank you so much, Anthony. Really wonderful to have you at GMU and online, and also looking forward to seeing you in person on April 26th at the Fairfax campus as well.
Let's see. I'm trying to see if I can. I don't see any hands raised yet.
I knew
Hanan.
we count on Hanan. Excellent.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Cook. The lecture was wonderful. Wanted to ask, so you had mentioned racial capitalism and how the traditional left or the Marxist lens often like skips over race when it comes to the formation of capitalism. And I think this kind of goes on to how there's a lot of critiques of like the populist left or like democratic socialists who are currently in national level politics of that their policies are like exclusionary to people of color or they don't factor in people of color enough. So how do like left populists manage to like integrate like racial equality, justice for Black people with their economic policy platforms while not being how do I say, like too wordy or being able to frame it correctly if you
Yeah.
have something to say on that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in my assessment, Bernie did not even do this enough, and I was a supporter of Bernie's during his presidential bid. And so I think what has to be done is trying to contextualize the history of Black oppression as a as a form of as self-interest. You know, the need for white working class to understand the ways in which they have been systemically disadvantaged by the continued oppression of Black folk and others, right? I think that's probably the entry point. Now, it's definitely true that even the white working class has been advantaged by the history of Black subordination. But it is true and probably a more compelling strategy or tactic to show them, educate them on how things could be a hell of a lot better if they did not permit the ruling class to pit groups against each other, right? And to provide concrete examples of the way that is done with regard to using Black people to undermine the value of white labor in a segregated and dual labor force, breaking strikes, as it were, the existential capital of racism that Du Bois spoke of, in which basically white people have been offered by those in power the satisfaction that no matter how bad things are for them, which can often be very close or worse than the way things are for Black people, that they nevertheless should be thankful and grateful because they are in the club. They are one of them. They are white. The existential capital of whiteness serves as compensation for forms of continued subordination of the white working class in ways that will continue to hurt the movement, right? So if you gave me a couple of hours and this was my job to do, I believe that I could come up with, short, pithy, characterizations of that, right? Slogans, as it were, that could teach and rally simultaneously. That's the work that I think we have to do.
Great. Thank you so much.
Dave, I think you're next.
Well, hopefully I can reframe this question properly here. The book by Noam Chomsky about manufactured consent, and he's talking about back in 1988 about how the media is getting all contorted, and we're almost 40 years after that book. The book was very popular. It's been part of university reading for many university students. And it looks like to me that we have moved into the world that Chomsky was warning us about. And so I'm kind of looking at 40 years of this and says, have we really progressed? I don't know. I just maybe you might have some comment on that, because I kind of see the same thing. Dr. King was giving us a message, and it doesn't look like it's moved people far enough yet.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I do, and unfortunately, when I see, left of center movements, even like Black Lives Matter, I see the gap that exists in their thinking strategies, their approaches, right? Compared to, the King that I just described, or the Black Panthers for sure, right? The kind of willingness to integrate holistically a critique of disparate forms of oppression, right? Imperialism and militarism with racism, with classism, exploitation, with now patriarchy and gender oppression, right? The growth has not been there as much as I would like it to be. And I've talked with friends and even to friends in the Black Lives Matter movement about this. And there's always this tension, I think, between the old heads on the one hand and the baton, the torch being passed to the next generation and letting them control their own movements. This King was 26 when he stepped into the leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott, coming out of Boston University, doing his doctoral studies. He was only 26 years old, right? But in a few years, there was a generational tension between him and many of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee students, as there was between Thurgood and him, right? This thing goes on. It repeats itself, right? The cycle. And, we got to think of a better way of institutionally, movement-wise, transferring knowledge, right? In a way that defers to younger generations to take that baton, but also does not forfeit due to arrogance and the like, the real knowledge and insights that have been garnered from the past, right? I've been thinking about that, and I'm thinking about making it one of my initiatives in the community work that I do. Is one of the things that we are whiteboarding and looking at in greater detail. And so stay tuned.
Ben, you have a question?
Yeah. So speaking of passing things on institutionally, it reminds me that John Dale teaches a course on social enterprise and cooperatives, and I'm wondering if you could make the connection for those gathered here between your talk today and the work that Gatebridge is doing in the DMV. And you made this turn from the political to the economic, just as Dr. King, who had always had an economic platform, was deepening his economic agenda as the 60s turned into the late 60s. So I just wanted to invite you to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. So I started the lecture with King's address at the Lincoln Memorial, and on the eve of his delivering that address, W.E.B. Du Bois dies in Ghana, right? Having left America, having quit America, because he saw the possibilities, the hope for Black progress to be impossible in this setting, right? So he turned to Pan-Africanism, and interestingly enough, made some amends with his old nemesis, Booker T. Washington, in basically saying that, Booker T had certain things right. His complicity with a status quo that would tolerate the lynching of Black people, Black person being lynched every other day during the quote unquote progressive era, 1890s to the end of World War I, and his complicity with the powers that be, he always objected to. But building institutions, right, was something he came to see as extraordinarily important that could stand the test of time. So Black colleges and universities, Black fraternities, sororities, organizations that come out of the Booker T. Washington approach, he came to see as being something that we should consciously integrate into our understanding of what the struggle means, right? For Du Bois, cooperatives, right, being, the Marxist socialist that he was, right, was extraordinarily important, right, because it provided an alternative to extractive economics that basically descended upon communities, extracted income and wealth of not only financial resources, but of personhood to now build the wealth of their communities. It challenged that, provided an alternative to that, right? And so he was a strong cooperatives guy, big cooperatives guy, right? And so what I try to do in my work in understanding the history and the theoretical evolution of Black thinkers and white thinkers on this as well, people of color and white people, white thinkers on this, is to try to see where they ended up, right? So I'm interested in where Frederick Douglass ends up, but I'm interested in where Du Bois ends up, what he settles on. And I'm looking at where, King ends up, where Malcolm ends up, right? And in doing that analysis, ironically, it is often around the same place, it's similar, it's in the same ballpark, right? And so that ballpark always comes to appreciate the need to wage battles at least on two different fronts. One front being the constant assault that Black people are on in having a retrenchment of rights, voting rights, housing rights, economic rights taken away, and the need to fight a battle for representation and legislation that protects those rights, yes, but also on the front of community building and what we now call community wealth building, right? And so, having understood that years ago, my path has always been to try to make space for both of those fronts of resistance. At times, one being emphasized in my life and work more than another. At this particular juncture in my life, more time being spent on community wealth building, community autonomy, liberation within Black communities in a way that understands the whole and connects what's being done in Ward 7 and Ward 8 to the oppression that is being visited on Black people in Ghana, Liberia, Kenya, or brown people in Latin America around the world, right? Trying to do that and trying to model in the local work what may be workable in other contexts, right? And building understanding and knowledge along the way in collaborating with those other groups, right? So this effort that I'm engaged in right now, which is focused on the first thing that we have researched and developed and brought through a process of ideation, incubation, and acceleration now into actually standing it up and scaling it, is an initiative called Rosie's Grocery Store. And I'll speak more about that, in April. But Rosie's Grocery Store is a multi-stakeholder cooperative that is owned by the workers, owned by the consumers, and owned by, in part, a minority interest of what I call ecosystem stewards like Gatebridge that can really fight the battles for these enterprises that oftentimes workers and consumers and residents in communities don't have the resources or time to fight. If you want to go fast, go along. If you want to go far, go together. It is mutuality, mutualism, solidarity, and cooperativeness of bringing people together and enterprises together in order to be able to go far and to have sustainability in all of this. So does that sufficiently answer your question? Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you too, in working in this new community building around Rosie's Grocery, to what extent have you been drawing on a pool of collective memory from the sort of home rule in the DMV area, especially Washington, D.C., before Marion Barry's home rule? We know we've been reading about the rich history of cooperatives that were being built at that time. And I was wondering if you're deliberately tapping into that as you start to build a community around this new initiative.
Oh my God, yes, no question about it. Invaluable resources. At one point in time, as you probably know, Washington, D.C. was home to more cooperatives per capita than any other place in the nation, maybe with the exception of New York, but it was very close, right? We had and continue to have a lot of housing cooperatives in place, right? But at one point in time, we had many, many more business cooperatives, non-housing cooperatives as enterprises in the district. And, that dissipated for a number of reasons, right? Like any business, cooperatives, they're difficult to sustain. According to SBA, reports, 50% of all businesses that are started in year one are going to be shut down by year 5, right? And by year 10, it's about 70%. There are easier things to do in life than to start, successfully launch, and sustain a business, right? Cooperatives would normally focus their attentions in low income, under duress communities have even a higher hurdle to clear. And so the need for the approach that I'm taking, that I described in greater detail in April, is intended to deal with a couple of problems that we know exist for businesses, including co-ops, failing. One is undercapitalization, right? And so Gatebridge focuses a lot of its attention on aggregating the capital that then gets invested in the form of patient capital debt into the cooperatives to stand them up, CapEx and OpEx expenses, right? That we recoup over 20, 30 years or what have you, right? Not the typical 3 to 5 years, right? So we focus on capital aggregation. We focus on channeling the expertise needed to successfully launch and sustain an enterprise. We go out, beat the bushes, we find the operating partners, we find, the entities and the people necessary to bring into coalition so that the cooperative will not be short on the ability to access a network and community of support to facilitate its sustainability, right? As you know, one of the big reasons why businesses fail in the Black community and Hispanic community more so than the white community is because the two former communities don't have as many lawyers, business people, entrepreneurs that they can readily pick up the phone, call, I got this problem. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with this inventory shortfall? How do you deal with, HR, human resource issues? How do you deal with, the marketing aspect of this? And when you don't have people that you can call on to just kind of help you troubleshoot those issues, you're much more likely to shoot yourself in the foot or worse, right? And so that's where we come in. We provide that family resource, that network that businesses often do not have to assure greater sustainability, right? All of this was learned from reviewing the histories of co-ops in DC and elsewhere. I made it a point of understanding the reasons why co-ops fail more than I studied even why they succeed, right? And so we have built an intervention, an initiative that assimilates that historic knowledge and utilizes it, I hope, effectively. The last thing I'll say about it is that, co-ops have had a precarious history with the relationship between themselves and political power. As you know, one of the principles of cooperatives is to remain independent, autonomous, right? And so sometimes, even in DC, we develop too great of dependence on the city government, and politicians understanding that relationship often exploited it. And when exploited, it often seemed as though to people in the community that the co-op board was in the back pocket of this politician or that politician, right? Which bred, dissension and falling out and a lack of loyalty with regard to patronage and support for the co-op. That stuff is real, right? And so, we understand that there is a delicate line there. And what we've done is try to create an initiative that really takes that into consideration and tries to avoid the pitfalls of being tethered too tightly to government.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one last question. Maybe, we're pretty tight. What do you think, Ben?
I think we do. I was just asking Cindy Manala whether she might want to pose the question she asked about the triple evils to Professor Cook.
Hello.
Cindy? There you go.
Yes. So I asked that, could you elaborate on this idea that racism, militarization, and excessive materialism, how are these three things tied together?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, good question. So King understood this on a number of fronts that I think are still relevant. One is that the defense budget, given Eisenhower's, warnings of, concerns about the military industrial complex, was using war as a way of building, feeding, and enriching the defense companies and contractors associated with war. And so, given that, incentive, there would be an incentive, like it or not, to look for the next war because war pays well for certain people and groups, right? And so King understood that the more and more that budget grew, the more money would be off the table for his Marshall Plan, for some notion of Black reparations, for the kind of economic justice agenda that he had in mind, right? And so you needed to critique it and to build up a movement of resistance against it, because conservatives would always argue that defense must necessarily trump initiatives of social welfare in the nation, and therefore have fewer and fewer dollars available to achieve that objective, right? So that's one way in which it's connected. You can't adequately serve Black people in communities of color, right? And deal with the issues of labor, if you do not have the tax funds in order to accomplish that, right? The second link, though, is that these wars were being waged on the whole, Vietnam, certainly Southeast Asia, against people of color, right? And the domination of people of color, denying them their freedom, liberty, and autonomy, because you wanted to impose upon them a certain orthodoxy concerning free capital and capitalism compared to communism, right, was creating terrible hardships and oppression with regard to people of color around the globe. And so, if in doing that, then what you're doing is you're creating a greater platform for worker exploitation, because the track record, even then during King's day, of corporations in those areas, in those countries, was not a good one. It was, a plantation economy. It was the same exploitation that Black people had experienced in America. And they were being extracted from, and the wealth of those companies were growing. And with tax evasion and the like, there was nothing coming back into America to really deal with America's problems, right? So he saw the same MO that had been utilized against Black and brown people in America being utilized against brown people and people of color throughout the world, and understood that that had to be challenged, that had to be dealt with. So there was the interconnection on that front as well. War billed as, fighting for democracy and containing the spread of communism, right, was really a war to continue to pad the pockets of the wealthy who control those contracts and who benefited from war, and provided less opportunity to deal with the issues of race and class subordination within America.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic presentation and discussion, and we thank you for spending time with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in April, where I believe you're going to be speaking again with our next system speaker series. I would like to thank all of our guests today who are in our audience. Ben might have a word about the next event before we go, or do you want to just post that later?
It certainly will. It's available at nextsystem.gmu.edu. It's Samantha Agrawal, who's a postdoc at American University, giving a talk on participatory planning and the politics of Kerala in India. A lot of resemblances to the projects that people here in the DMV are working on, and a lot of lessons for us. I also posted in the chat the link to the Democratizing Nova Summit. So Anthony Cook will be our keynote speaker, and there will be also a major panel following that, and many workshops organized by people in the community here in Northern Virginia and DC and Maryland. And so please come together with us in person for that event at the Fairfax campus of GMU. And again, thanks so much for taking the time after teaching and everything else that you do, Anthony, to be with us and people both who are students and faculty here at GMU, and also others who've joined us from other parts of North America today. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the work you do, Ben and John. I really, really value and appreciate you guys.